Good evening, and I still would like to, or prefer to see our guests, small in number though they might be, coming a little closer so that we get that intimacy in conversation which we hope will be the character of our proceedings this evening. As we deliberate on the life and times of Sir Vivian Richards, as the state banquet, which has been planned for Thursday evening, has been dubbed by the organizers and promoters of this event to Sir with Love. And as we heard Zoral explaining, all the cricketing sirs or cricketing knights will be in attendance here as we commemorate the 60th, I would prefer to say Earth Day, of our national hero, the only living national hero in the pantheon of the heroes of Antigua and Barbuda, Sir Vivian Richards, or as the protocol suggested by the British, who have perhaps instituted this sort of knighthood appellations, Sir Vivian, and not Sir Richards, but Sir Vivian. I think appropriately this evening, and I'd like to extend my own personal condolences to the father of the late Renako Morton. Pacer, as we know, is and has been an integral part of cricket in and around his Bowlands community and also on the Antigua and Leeward Islands scene, you know. And we share with him the great loss that the loss of a youth, a son, must be. And I'd like to personally extend sympathies to Pacer Williams, to Renako's family, wife and children, his mother, and all the others whom he has left to mourn, which indeed will include the entire cricketing fraternity of the Caribbean. It's an honor and pleasure for me this evening to be involved with honoring Sir Viv on this time of his 60th Earth Day, a time when in Antigua we are also celebrating the 70th Earth Day and the 50th year of his profession of another great Antiguan icon, Sir MacLean Emmanuel, Lord Shortshirt. And I'm even more pleasured to be involved in this activity alongside such distinguished company. The Reverend Wes Hall, of course, whose ebullience on the field is now matched by his oratorical brilliance, Reverend Wes Hall. Mikey Holden, known as the Whispering Death on the field, but equally now as profound and objective as an analyst and commentator, not whispering his comments, but saying them full-mouthed and wholeheartedly, profoundly and objectively as he analyzes and commentates on the game around the world. Hugh C. Gore, Rashidi X as we might know him, like Viv and Mervyn, from a great cricketing and sporting family, and from a tradition then that he has personally proudly followed on the field, and of it as manager, respected not only by the Antiguan teams and players, or Leeward Island teams and players with whom he has been associated and whom he has managed, but by all regional teams and a number of regional players across this Caribbean with whom he again would have come in contact. So it's again a great pleasure to be associated with such illustrious company. Mervyn, of course, the brother of Sir Viv, and who sometimes might be mistaken for Sir Viv, with whom I've also had a long association. And though I might not have been influential in fostering his great sporting talents, which need no elucidation to an Antiguan audience. But I perhaps would be credited, I think, even by Emma, as having begun or initiated his now quite flourishing dramatic career on stage and on film. The last time I was involved in such a forum, it was alongside two equally distinguished ones of the Caribbean here. I refer, of course, to, I think it was honoring Viv's 50th Earth Day. It was a function out at Memorial Bay, can't remember the year. But I refer to Sir Hilary Beckles and to Leonard Tim Hector, both of whom, of course, for different reasons, are not with us tonight. Allow me, though, the presumption of presenting to you an historical perspective, an understanding, my understanding, which was largely shaped and defined by these two eminent Caribbean scholars, Sir Hilary and Sir Leonard, and which I believe, if they had been with us this evening, they would have been looking along these same historical lines in which they are so well researched and learned. And in fact, allow me to do this as we set the context, and environment that produced the man that we honor in these times, Sir Vivian. As we examine past great teams, as we honor our great heroes, we should do so, and I suggest that we do so with, and are doing so even in these commemorations, with the historian's understanding, the understanding that the lessons from the past elucidate and influence our present, and therefore point us to the future realities, the future objectives, and the future necessities. Sir Viv represents a rich heritage and a rich legacy and tradition. A legacy and tradition which I am sure will be understood and appreciated by our Caribbean brothers with us this evening, and sisters with us this evening. But a tradition, a legacy, a history, which has a peculiarly small island perspective also, with which we could just briefly mention. From the Leeward Islands, cricketing historical perspective, organized cricket in the Leeward Islands can be dated back to 1913, when Governor Sir Heathcote Bell, governor of the Leeward Islands, presented a shield for cricket competition amongst the islands of the Leeward Islands. That's 1913. That's, by next year, we'll be celebrating and commemorating 100 years. So you see what I say in the particular reference to us in the Leewards, our cricketing, organized cricketing legacy on that regional level dates back 100 years. It must be a proud legacy. It indicates, of course, that organized cricket in the individual nations, in the individual islands, Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Dominica, which was also part of the Leeward Islands Federation and political organization during those times. It must also be understood from that the organized cricket within the individual islands must have been of a particularly high standard that the governor could say, well, organized competition between these islands. A competition then that produced highly competitive action with all the islands who were involved, Antigua and St. Kitts, Dominica, Montserrat at first, later Nevis, and then Anguilla in the 80s coming on board also in this competition for the Heathcote Bell Shield. Some highly competitive action, some picnic-style activity when all the islands were gathered for 2 weekends, 2 weeks in one particular country for the competition in cricket amongst them for this Heathcote Bell Shield, and produced also great individuals. I shudder to even begin to mention some of them for fear of omitting, forgetting, we might say, others who might have been equally prominent and who might just not immediately come to mind. But some of those, in my more recent recollection then, and I'm sure there would have been others even in the times prior to those 40s and so on, of which we would be a little more familiar. Selene Harris of St. Kitts, people like Austin Eddy also of St. Kitts, Howell from Nevis, after whom the Howell Berridge Shield competition between Nevis and St. Kitts was named. In Antigua, of course, Sidney Wallin, Malcolm Richards, the Gore brothers, Sammy Henry, as some other names that would come. But cricketers whose legends, whose exploits are legendary and spoken about with awe by their contemporaries and their peers, and who would very well stand up in comparison with those other greats, Caribbean greats of our more modern era. Another important, and as we mentioned, the Gores, Leo, Charlie, and Willie Gores, whom, of course, respectfully, I could and should refer to as Uncle Leo, Uncle Willie, and Uncle Charlie. In mentioning them, it brings to light another important aspect of this Leeward Islands cricketing, cultural, social tradition. We remember, of course, that the game of cricket was bequeathed to us by our colonial masters. And as such, our teams were largely dominated in the Caribbean by expatriate colonialists then, by Europeans, by Caucasians, white people. So that they dominated not only in the makeup of the teams, but very much so in the captaincy of these teams, who would often be the managers on their estate or at the sugar factory, in the case here in Antigua. But there was a growing, and one of the things that we remark when we look at aspects of Antiguan and Leeward Island cricketing history is the predominance of African black players in and amongst these white teams, these white-dominated teams, at a very early age. We know when we read of the history in Barbados, for example, that there were the gentlemen, and even in the English context too, gentlemen and players, professionals, the players, so-called. The gentlemen were those who were playing it for the love of the game and on an amateur basis, obviously the colonialists and the expatriates. And in the Barbados situation, though these players, these professionals, could play in the domestic competition in Barbados, they were not allowed to compete in the intercolonial matches between the bigger colonies, between Barbados, Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica. Only the gentlemen, amateur players, the colonialists then would be competing. So just to give an idea of the domination of the game, but to show that particular peculiarity of the Leeward Islands situation, and particularly Antigua, where, as we look at some of the pictures of some of those teams, it's remarkable that the amount of African, black, local Antiguan players then that were rising in to these particular teams. As an aside, and I allude again to conversations with and reasonings with Sir Leonard, the great Tim Hector, as to account for why, and one of the factors why the Leeward Islands had been kept out of cricket in the wider Caribbean context. And he alludes to this fact of the predominance of black African players in these sides, in some of these smaller islands, and certainly here in Antigua and in the Leewards, as opposed to the other, where a larger white population would have been able to accommodate a larger portion of the gentlemen, as we say, on those teams. and who then they would be condescending enough to play amongst each other, but would be obviously keeping out of the smaller islands because of the predominance of the non-colonialists on those teams. That's just an aside. But it brings us again to Leo, Charlie, and Willie, who along with Sammy Henry first refused to play under a white captain, beginning what CLR James talks about as the democratization process within the game of cricket. As he says, cricket goes beyond the boundary, so that some of the social inequalities in the societies at large were expressed on the cricket field. And it was something that the locals, the African, the black population, the cricket players, local cricket players, would have had to fight against, just as how in the wider society, politicians then on that other sphere would have been fighting to reduce, eliminate this white domination of the economy, of the politics, the governance, and also of the cricket. It was a fight, of course, that fight towards democratization, which was also reflected on the Caribbean level. And in the fight to appoint Sir Frank Worrell as captain, that was in the late 50s. When we're talking about here in Antigua, the rebellion by Leo, Charlie, and Willie and Sammy, the Gores and Sammy Henry, occurred in the 1940s. So Hugh might be able to tell us a little more of the exact date and time of that whole process within the Leeward Islands. So this then just in elucidating some of the tradition and the legacy and the history, cricket-wise, here in the Leeward Islands, out of which sprung and which gave us Sir Isaac Vivian Alexander Richards. It's a legacy, a heritage, values and traditions which are honed and fostered too in the English public school system, our grammar schools, as has been well documented, of course, by CLR James in the Beyond the Boundary, and we've heard Tim expounding on these all the time too. The English public school as one of the vehicles of the transfer or spread of colonialist values, and thereby of colonialist traditions and colonialist domination also. A tradition that embodied the stiff upper lip of strength and courage in adversity, of camaraderie and team spirit, of respect for opponents. A tradition, a legacy that was encapsulated in the phrase, "This is simply not cricket." When one referred to some kind of aberrant behavior, you just say, "That's simply not cricket." And that encapsulated the values that cricket and English colonialists were trying to imbibe or pass on then to the colonial people over whom they had subjugation. It was a tradition to have upholding that old school tie, be it the green and green that we have known at the AGS then, a typical English public school, or the purples that Mikey might have known at KC, or the blues that our lodge icon, Hugh C. Gore, would have known, that old school tie, that old school color, and standing up in a way for it in the way that we saw our cricketers of that particular era and tradition then, coming out of that, standing up for team, for country, for community, and for everything else that had really given us their whole talent and everything. It had a tradition to not telling, not snitching on others, so that the whole class would be castigated for somebody did, but nobody is saying who did it. Of course, it put an onus and a responsibility on the perpetrator when the class come down on him to own up to and to take responsibility for his actions. So that's another aspect. Support for team. My old man, my father used to tell me about the old days of the whole grammar school down at where we call Pasture, ARG. And the cry that they would be using back in the 1940s when he was there. School, school, come along, school. We know of Lloydston Jacobs, and when I, as a master at the AGS, when grammar school is playing down at the recreation grounds, I have to go down there with a form register, and I have to mark it. And you have to present an excuse if you don't come. It was that sort of support that was institutionalized almost within that whole English public school system, and certainly by people like Lloydston Jacobs and others within the educational fraternity at the time. I contrast that to the present. When we hear of the other day, 2 school teams playing what appeared to be a final here in Antigua, and the only people present at the ground were the 13 members of each team, about 26 people. No schoolmaster, no coach, or no supporters. And I say and posit from this that the traditions which we have spoken about, the noble traditions of which we have spoken about, which were upheld so brazenly and courageously by people like Viv and our successful team, have largely been lost. I say this without any disrespect, but I see this tradition as being largely lost, as subsumed in what I refer, again, no disrespect, to as the Kentucky generation. I'm not referring to a horse race derby. It's subsumed under the just another game syndrome that might have permeated our cricket thinking and our outlook on life at a certain time. It's also permeated and seen, or that whole tradition lost in the loss of unity in our Caribbean islands. Professor Beckles, if we can allude again to those Caribbean scholars, and even in the C.L.R. James idea, shows the tie-up between the date, 1958, of Sober's making 365, and the formation at that time of the Caribbean unity. And Viv, Andy, Willett, the small islands coming on to and into the full context of Caribbean cricket, represented the full flowering of the Caribbean consciousness under a Caribbean-minded leader such as Clive Lloyd, the protege of a Caribbean-minded politician like Forbes Burnham. So the times of greatest unity is when we see the greatest flowering of the Caribbean talent. So that I say that these traditions have been lost, subsumed, submerged under these 3 things: the loss of unity. Or if you want to look at that loss of unity on the other side, the flip side, the re-emergence of insularity then. So that just by way of setting a context. And just briefly in ending, allow me just a personal reflection of my emotional attachment with Sir Viv and with that other great Antiguan icon at whom we are honoring at these times, Sir MacLean Emmanuel Lord Shortshirt. Not only was I associated with them, Viv at the grammar school, and Shortshirt from the early 70s, late 60s, before and even as they were rising to their pinnacles of glory. But I am also born in the same Piscean sign in which these 2 great Antiguans also are. And to boot, the year 1976 was the year my son was born, a year in which we would call it the annus mirabili of Sir Viv, when he was creating havoc in England, and which time too Shortshirt was batting it up in Trinidad, those 2 Antiguan Piscean greats. It strengthened my emotional attachment there on that highly personal note. But even as they progressed and as we continued to associate, and I saw both of these becoming involved and embracing the black consciousness, black power, Rastafari, outbursts that were sweeping across the Caribbean in those 70s, late 60s, and 70s, one began to feel that even greater emotional attachment to Sir McLean and to Sir Viv, when his stance on the whole South African situation, where he refused to become an honorary white, you know, we again applauded the great man, Sir Viv. And others will be able to show some of the cricket insides and some of the little dressing room anecdotes about Sir Viv, or about that fiercely competitive ovals community, which also spawned the great man, and which was also responsible for that intensity and that competitive nature and side of Sir Viv. But to me, two of the enduring qualities or endearing qualities of Sir Viv have been off the field rather than on the field, as much as we salute and applaud those exploits on the field. But Viv, in his humility, had the knack of being able to break the ice, to make you feel at home in any circumstance and in any surroundings. I remember once a Rastafari brethren, colleague of mine, Antigan, at Sabina, and at the end of a day's play, Ras Destaja and I went into the dressing room. I, of course, knew most of the players and so on in the dressing room, but Desta, not being so familiar, was a bit standoffish. And Viv just called to me across the room and says, "Frank, you think your partner don't think I don't know who he is? He forget I used to run around him on the football field when he was playing for Param?" And that immediately broke the ice and brought him right into the fold of the West Indies team. For truly, and again, this I think is his great quality, he encapsulates what again the English poet of colonialism, Rudyard Kipling, says, and does it so aptly and so well in his own right, that he walked with kings and he kept the common touch. That was Sir Isaac Vivian Alexander Richards, and that will be his endearing memory to one of whom I could consider, well, his close friends. But that would be my enduring memory of Isaac Vivian Alexander Richards. Thank you very much for allowing me this little historical contextualization of Sir Viv.